Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we want to discuss the age-old question, which is best, the film or the book of the film, or the book or the film of the book. Today we want to discuss that question on the basis of a wonderful novel, 2000 novel by Michel Faber, Under the Skin, and the 2012 film by Jonathan Glazer, also called Under the Skin, and obviously based on the novel of the same name. Now, of course, this question is an old question, quite simply, because cinema has been making great use of literature in general, and all types of writing, of course, throughout. There are some perfectly good reasons for that, and lately, of course, financially, it has become very expensive to hire people to write a script specifically for a film, and it is very often cheaper to buy the rights of a novel, for example, or a short story where everything is kind of already pre-chewed and can be turned into a script for a film a little bit more easily. Now, throughout this video, we'll keep in mind some very famous, let's say, translations. We'll refer at some stage to Harry Potter, of course, the J.K. Rowling series, each of which book has been made into a film. We'll share a quick word about The Third Man, a very famous sort of green adaptation or script written for The Third Man, a very cult film, of course, and then turned into a novel, or a novella perhaps. The Cloud Atlas one, of course, the David Mitchell 2004 wonderful novel, turned by the Wachowskis in 2012 into a film. And I think the first question when we think about all those adaptations, is Harry Potter better in book form or in film form, is quite simply to ask the question, well, does asking that question make sense in the first place? Now, let's consider for a minute, of course, the obvious differences between film and book. And a film imposes images. Film imposes a sense of reality on things that were only described. Not necessarily when I describe something, unless I am extremely detailed. In any case, at some stage, you're going to have to try and shape those descriptions, abstract, obviously, into something that you can represent. And necessarily, there are going to be slight differences between what you may represent and what I may represent. Okay, but that's easy. So that, in Under the Skin, when we see the actor, Scarlett Johansson, it does indeed take a little bit of adjustment for the reader of the novel Under the Skin, because in the novel, the main narrator, the main character really, this girl, is described as plain, being very plain. She does have an attribute in order to do what she needs to do. And her attribute is basically historically associated with objectification of women, of course. She has large breasts. Now, obviously, if you choose, like Glazer did for his film Scarlett Johansson, you're not choosing a plain woman. You are choosing one woman acknowledged as being very attractive. And necessarily here, you're imposing something which completely, say, obliviates the images that you may have had in your head. So that's one problem, is obviously that if the image that you developed while reading is strongly anchored in your head, the clash with the embodiment of that idea on screen might be simply too much to bear, and that will be the end for you. You won't even consider whether the adaptation is well made or not. So that's an obvious problem. The other obvious problem is that you have to recreate whichever world is described on the page while that world is being recreated for you. So there are all sorts of practical reasons why it doesn't really make much sense from a very practical point of view to compare book and film. Narratively speaking, a book can allow itself to do things that a film might find difficult. So, for example, Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell is a book in sort of 7 parts and 7 more parts, where there is some sort of continuity, but that continuity is sometimes hard to spot, so you have to be very vigilant. And some characters kind of come and go and transform, and there is a link between all those 7 stories and those 7 characters and sets of characters. It is very strong, but at the same time it is not so strong that it is one story. It really is 7 different parts. Now, the Wachowskis, when they decided to film that book, decided to try and recreate that sense of linkage, but at the same time of distinct, as it were, characters and situations, which brought them to make what I think is an absolutely wonderful film. But it is not the type of film that you can easily watch, or that everybody is necessarily feeling like watching all the time, because this sense of continuity, discontinuity, means that you have at times extremely short scenes at different moments with different characters, and sometimes the characters look the same, but there are different characters, etc. And it makes for, I think, a wonderful visual experience, an incredibly inventive and original way to treat the narratives of novels. But it is also, obviously, from a movie-going experience, not your typical Hollywood blockbuster. Now, the main problem with comparing books and films is obviously to do with the interpretation of what the book is about, or what the book is trying perhaps to get us to think about. Now, remember, a filmmaker is a reader, and as a reader, he or she is an interpreter of the book. Just like when you read the book, you interpret the book, that is, you give it some sort of sense, some sort of meaning, or multiplicity of meanings, perhaps, depending on who you are, what you know, how much you've read, all those things. Well, the filmmaker will do the same. And mind you, the filmmaker might not even be the only one reading the novel, but let's just keep it at one person. Now, that person, having finished the novel, will have a sense of what that novel is about. And that's where the problem starts, of course. If, as is very likely, that interpreter is not you, and they have a different interpretation from yours, then obviously you will resent the way they take that novel and the different direction from the one you are usually going with that novel, or did go with that novel. It occurs to me that there was a film made of Less Than Zero, a novel I've talked about previously on the channel, an American novel from the 80s, where it seems to me, as an interpreter, that the book is very much about the absence of redemption, the absence of moral way out, the absence of humanity. And the film made of that book goes in a completely different direction, very much in a moral, redemptive direction, which I think is completely antithetical to the novel. And obviously, I find that the film here is very bad. Now, the question really for all of us is, are we judging those films on the basis of themselves, or are we judging those films on the basis of our experience, interpretation, and reading of the novels? It is, of course, the second, which is why it makes no sense to compare book and film, simply because, again, both are very different media, with both having limitations or immense fields of creativity that the other one cannot match, and two, they are ultimately subject to the interpretation of the filmmaker or the bookmaker, of course. Now, as I said, Under the Skin, the plot is only gradually revealed, and I am not going to reveal it in this video because I strongly urge you to go and read that book. It is not a very big book at all, and it is very extremely well done. Faber is just top of the tree type of writer anyway, so I strongly encourage you to read him in general, and he can write in very different genres as well. He's a fantastic craftsman, I think. And so the story is quite simply that, well, you've got this girl on the roads of Scotland, and she's basically forever in a car just going around picking up men. And how does she pick up men? Well, she is plain. She's not a prostitute or anything, not at all. Well, she picks up men because, again, she has those big bosom. And that is, of course, echoed in the film because Scarlett Johansson is also forever in a car. Now, of course, again, it's very hard to imagine that men would make complete abstraction of how she looks to concentrate solely on her breasts. So necessarily here, the sort of sexualization, objectification is, let's say, slightly different. There is a reason, I'm sure, why Faber chose that instead of having a very pretty woman, let's say, in a completely normal way. And I think that is not necessarily to the credit of men in general, and perhaps that bit necessarily gets lost, or perhaps the filmmaker was not interested in it. It's also, of course, the same. Now, in the novel, being on the road for hours, the landscape is very, very present. And he's really always she is always commenting on it. And the landscape is present also in its sort of, let's say, coldness, right? It comes across as not very inviting, usually cold, rainy, windy, blustery, all those things. Now, in the film, he's really, really trying to recreate that sense of landscape as well. The camera very often pans out on the hills of Scotland. There's snow here and there and all the like. But necessarily here, you are being shown a landscape, and perhaps people in big coats, and so you infer that it's cold and this and that. In the book, as usual, it might be that the resonance with what the landscape evokes, that relationship between, let's say, the coldness outside, the absence mostly of life outside, her loneliness, her sort of existence on its own, almost, and her detachment, that comes perhaps more strongly across in the novel. But again, a camera can only do so much without a voiceover. So these relationships can also be evoked by, again, a shot of her in the car on her own, or just standing by the road, looking around, etc. But necessarily, again, it is not a question of comparing here, it is a question of being able to play with what you have and hope that the reader or the spectator will transform the information, be it written or given in images, and make it their own, of course. There are, of course, some weird elements in the book because at some stage that woman will discover something in the hills of Scotland, something really rather unexpected, and that takes the book in a slightly or even completely different direction, as it were, from a very atmospheric, evocative, mysterious, foggy story into a sort of more mystery-like and weird territory. And here the novel has a problem, of course, because this slow transformation, those little touches that Michel Faber gives us in a novel, those little, sometimes, allusions to things, references to a sentence here or a word there that sort of jars because it's slightly out of place, but it alerts you without you knowing what it means really, or you don't really know what it refers to, but it just, if you read with care, of course, you think, that's weird, why does he say that? But it kind of accumulates. It's much more difficult to do that in a film. You can't forever, have the camera, show something that would be out of shot and that as a precursor to something else. This is, difficult to do repeatedly, of course, on film. You have to vary as well what you do with a camera. So the filmmaker here, Glazer, took almost a radical way out, which is that he has inserted at times what would be tempted to call psychedelic episodes, sometimes on split screens, sometimes the whole screen, sometimes the narrator, Scarlett Johansson, the main character, is involved in it, sometimes it's just shapes and transformations of shapes. And those come at different moments in the film, and they basically break the sort of normal shooting that goes on in the rest of the film. And those, of course, those moments do suggest a break or a a change not only of mood and atmosphere, but also a change of world, perhaps. And I think that's a very inventive way to relate or introduce and sort of suggest the second half of the book as well. The novel in itself is really marvelous, and I really strongly urge you to watch it. But the film really, on its own, while it may have perhaps some passages that are a little bit long, notably some of those psychedelic passages can get a little bit, not tiresome exactly, but perhaps there's a few too many. The problem that the film has with sort of the big revelation as it comes in the second half of the novel or the film, really. Here again, of course, it's much more difficult for the camera to recreate her sense, the narrator's sense, of what is going on, and the doubts that start to creep in, or the questions that start to creep in, and of course her trying to make sense of what's going on, since it's so abnormal, since it's so surprising. Recreating that sort of mind trying to make sense of a new reality is very, very difficult to do again on camera. And in that sense, I think that while the film is very inventive and very creative, at times, of course, cannot do what I think a novel is best equipped to do. Now, we know all this, of course, because if we again go back to The Third Man, the classics of 20th century cinema, a film from the end of the 40s, I think, 1940s. It was based off a script by Graham Greene, the immense English writer. And Graham Greene's script, of course, was really written so that the film could be actually made. In other words, it was a book in the service of a film. Now, if you, afterwards, Greene turned it into a novella, called The Third Man, so it's about 100 pages long, I think. And it's basically a beefing up, a fleshing out of the script that had been written for the film. And it's glaring because while as a novella it works quite well, it is your typical Greene stuff, with loads of religious symbols and moral quandaries. And while it did adapt a couple of passages so that they would make more sense in a novelistic way compared to the film, it is also obvious that the film itself is a work of art on its own, and that here the book, the script, the novella, is more some sort of flesh around which, or with which, Carol Reed, the filmmaker, can make an absolutely incredible artistic aesthetic object with all those camera angles and all those plays on dark, light, black and white, which have made, of course, the film so famous these days. So in that sense, it would be senseless, would be meaningless to compare the Graham Greene novella with the film, because both of them are trying to achieve something very, very different. And in fact, the sense of morality in the film is probably going in one direction that is less, let's say, religiously, not religiously inspired necessarily, but linked to religious sentiments in the case of Graham Greene in general. So what we have here really is that we end up with a solution to the problem. Which is best, the film or the book? Well, the question should not be asked. It's not a question well asked, as we say in French. The question really is, what have you made of each, and does each succeed on its own merits, and also on its own limitations, or number of things that they can actually do, which the other one cannot do. A book, in many ways, has a lot more freedom than a film, but at the same time, the film can express a lot more in a couple of seconds. And if you think about, I don't know, your typical 19th century realist novel, where descriptions, or Proust, where descriptions go on for pages, it is obvious that here a film can do, in a couple of seconds, couple of shots, what 10 pages might find more difficult to do. On the other hand, the effect on the one who reads or on the one who watches is ultimately what counts. And what counts, again, is the interpretation you make of each. So it is perfectly acceptable to have a differing or different interpretation of a novel from the filmmaker who read the same novel and came to a different conclusion, or wanted to come to a different conclusion. And here again, of course, there are many other considerations, financial notably when it comes to, for example, Hollywood. So, in short, what we can say here is that those two objects are very much worth your time on their own. The novel, I think, is a very, very, very good novel, and the film really, really deserves your attention. The filmmaker tried to do something that probably the filmmakers of Harry Potter didn't really try to do, and I can understand it, seeing the financial imperatives at work with Harry Potter. And the Glazer film is, of course, a small film. He really tried to internalize the novel and turn it into a real object of cinema. He didn't try simply to film the page and film the adventures, like one could argue Harry Potter, but he really tried to make the novel his own and then make a film, not the filming of a book, but a film on its own. And here we can only applaud him, I think, for that, just like we should applaud the Wachowski's brothers for having made Cloud Atlas, a 1 in a million film that deserves a lot of attention on its own, because what they have done again is take the novel, internalized it in their own way, seeing who they are, what they think, how they see the world, and turn it into a real film, not the filming of a book, but a film. And if you think about it that way, then this opposition between book and film simply disappears. A film should be a film on its own, a book should be a book on its own. With this, if you disagree, agree. If you have counter-examples or better examples than I do, and I'm sure you do drop a comment. It will always be appreciated. In the meantime, thank you very much. Bye-bye.